Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Currently, I serve on the MS Society's Community Review of MS Research Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people with MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions, connecting you to resources. Driving can be an important part of maintaining your independence. While MS may present challenges while you're behind the wheel, there are steps you can take to keep yourself and others safe while driving. Jenny Nordine, an occupational therapist and certified driver rehabilitation specialist at Driving to Independence, joins us today to explore how people with MS can safely maintain their driving independence through understanding vehicle modifications and accessibility options. Welcome, Jenny. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much, John.
When I introduced you, I mentioned that you were an occupational therapist. I'm hoping you can share how an occupational therapist can help someone with MS with their driving.
Well, as an occupational therapist, my training and education is really directed towards how an individual maintains their independence in what we would call activities of daily living. And driving is certainly one of those activities that we participate in on a daily basis. So driver rehab is really a specialty within occupational therapy.
Josh tells us he's been living with progressive MS for almost a decade. Lately, he's felt a slight decline in his mobility. So Josh wants to know how he will know when it's time to get a driving evaluation.
Yeah, this is a really common question. So I think that when we're seeing clients here in our office, they often talk about, I've just become more anxious or worried about my driving as I'm out and moving about. So maybe my right leg doesn't feel like it's moving towards that brake as easily as it should, or I'm not positive that my foot is actually firmly on a pedal, whether it's the accelerator or the brake. And really at the very end, people will start to talk about that they occasionally will need to lift their right leg behind the knee with their arm because they're not sure that it's actually gotten to the correct pedal. So, that is sort of a progression of the need for a comprehensive driving evaluation. But as soon the early signs are when somebody begins to feel anxious about driving, it's just not as easy as it used to be.
We heard from Kara, who says that she's recently had a relapse that affected her ability to grip the steering wheel. Her doctor told her she might benefit from a driving evaluation. First, can you explain what happens in a driving evaluation?
Absolutely. So, a comprehensive driving evaluation typically takes place in two parts. The first part of that evaluation is going to be clinically based. So we're going to look at a wide variety of things that could be affecting someone's ability to drive. That can be cognition, it can be vision, it can be motor, movement, and then of course sensory as well. If somebody is using a mobility devices of any kind, like a walker, a cane, a wheelchair, we're also going to assess that device as well, because that device needs to be transported, of course, with the individual. So we're going to do this full clinical assessment and determine one's ability to be a safe driver. If somebody is going to need some sort of adaptive equipment to be able to drive, such as hand controls, if again that right leg isn't behaving and we're not getting it between the pedals, or gripping the steering wheel as well. We have a fleet of vehicles that have a wide variety of adaptive driving equipment in it, so that we can begin a driving actual out behind the wheel assessment, generally in a parking lot, to begin to introduce that adaptive driving equipment. Now, depending on if somebody is addressing their driving skill early on in their diagnosis, they may not need adaptive driving equipment yet, but it's important to be able to establish that baseline of driving safety following that diagnosis. And then as the MS progresses, then we can begin to look at adaptive driving equipment. After we've done that behind the wheel assessment, then we'll come together as a group, the therapist, the client, and, a husband or wife or whomever is with the individual, and make a recommendation on what needs to happen next.
Well, how can Kara go about finding a qualified professional to perform this kind of assessment?
That's a great question. So we have a national professional organization called the Association for Driver-Rehabilitation Specialists. Its website is A as in apple, D as in dog, E, and then D as in dog.net. So ADED is the sort of the acronym that we go by, although it doesn't match the actual name. But there's a evaluator locator on that website that Kara can go to and find somebody in her area.
Are there any documents that Kara should bring with her to that evaluation, or is there any information that healthcare providers should submit on her behalf?
Yeah. So in order, our best practices as driving evaluators says that we need to have a doctor's prescription in order to complete that assessment. So the first thing that Kara should ask is for a prescription from her medical provider. Generally in our office, it just has to say something to the effect of driving assessment or driving test, something along those lines. So that's always the first step. Then, contacting the specific provider, evaluator that she's going to be seeing in her area to determine other things that is necessary for their needs. Here in our program, we ask people to make sure that they bring a list of their current medications, make sure that they have their eyeglasses with them, and of course that their driver's license is current and valid. So sometimes somebody has not been driving for a period of time when they come in for their driving assessment, and we discover that their driver license has expired last month, for instance. So making sure that that driver license is current is really important.
Samuel lives with MS and uses a power wheelchair for mobility. And Samuel wants to know what options are available that will allow him to maintain his driving independence.
Yeah. So, assuming that because he's using a power wheelchair, his lower extremities are weakened with his MS. So likely we're looking at some sort of adaptive driving equipment with regard to hand controls and things like that. But specifically regarding the power wheelchair, part of our assessment will be about identifying a vehicle and the vehicle modifications that might be necessary in order to transport that power wheelchair. And there are many. Wheelchair or lowered floor wheelchair accessible vans are quite common. This is something that he'd be able to drive up into in his wheelchair. But there's also different devices as far as being able to carry it, load and stow the wheelchair, for instance, in the bed of a pickup or on a hitch mounted lift or in the back of an SUV. It really depends on the vehicle that we're starting with. If Samuel is driving a Honda Accord, we may need to be looking at a different vehicle that will be able to accommodate transportation of that power wheelchair because of its weight and size, but that's part of the assessment that we would be doing for him.
Justine says she knows that modifications can help mitigate physical symptoms, but she's wondering whether there are any modifications that could assist with her cognitive changes.
Yeah, that's one of the most difficult parts of our job whenever we're seeing any diagnosis. But there are some specific things that you can do, sort of depending on the specific cognitive changes that somebody is seeing. So, for instance, limiting the driving area that somebody is driving in the state of Arizona, and this can change depending on the state or the jurisdiction that somebody is licensed within. But my most experience is here in Arizona. We're able to apply a 5-mile restriction to somebody's driver license. So what that means is that we will go out and assess their skills out near their home in their most familiar areas. So, for instance, that allows somebody to be able to maintain that level of independence within that 5 miles of their home, which is generally where we're doing most of our grocery shopping and banking and pharmacy and church or getting your hair cut. The majority of the things that we're doing are within that 5 miles. And this can be helpful with regard to, memory issues or navigation issues and things like that. Not everybody is successful in that 5-mile radius restriction, but often it can be sort of a bridge for that declining independence. So really, she'd have to determine what the restrictions are within her jurisdiction, but modifying the driving route, using right-hand turns only when possible, finding routes that have green arrows so that there's no decision to be made to yielding oncoming traffic. Those sorts of modifications or adjustments in driving can happen as well.
Angela tells us that her mother has lived with MS her whole adult life. And as her mother ages, Angela has begun to worry every time her mom gets behind the wheel. Now, Angela's mother won't listen to her concerns and has continued driving. Does Angela have a responsibility to report her mother as a potentially unsafe driver?
This goes back to the jurisdictions a little bit as well. Angela herself does not have a responsibility to report her mother. In most areas, as I talk to people around the country, most jurisdictions leave it to the driver themselves. We all are responsible adults, and we know we can't have an extra glass of wine at dinner and get out and drive. The same thing applies here. In some states, my understanding is in California, for instance, it can be the medical provider's responsibility to notify the motor vehicle department or the licensing agency of concerns about that individual. But a family member does not have responsibility to report a parent.
What would happen if someone who's been diagnosed with MS, someone like Angela's mother, were to get into an accident?
Who knows? The concern would be, so let's come back here to Arizona where I can sort of talk with experience. In the state of Arizona, there's a statute that says that if you've had a change in your medical condition or diagnosis, you have to notify the motor vehicle department. And that is a common requirement in most states. And what that does is it triggers a form that a medical provider needs to complete and submit to the motor vehicle department, noting whether or not this person should continue with their driving privileges. If somebody has not done that, the question becomes, in this fictitious collision that we're talking about, was that individual safe to be out driving post-diagnosis? Let's of course take MS as our example. And so we're not sure if they should have been driving. Sometimes that then requires an assessment through somebody like our company, and we then say yes or no that Susie is a safe driver, and therefore it's just a collision like we might get into at any point. But it does leave that question open as to whether or not the MS was affecting that individual during that situation, versus having completed the medical review process. Then that collision is, the MS in this case is documented, safe to be driving. Now that sort of eliminates that question as to whether or not somebody is safe to be driving.
We heard from Jessica, who says that she's actually been evaluated. She's ready for the next step, but she's feeling a little overwhelmed by the process. How can Jessica know which modifications she needs or what vehicle is right for her?
Yeah. Well, her evaluator should really be helping her through those steps. So generally what happens, and again, per our best practices as professionals, is we've completed that comprehensive assessment in two parts, like we talked about earlier. If Jessica is requiring some sort of adaptive equipment to drive, that recommendation would be made, and she would complete those training sessions with that driving evaluator. Now, in our state and in our practice here, all of those training sessions are required to be completed in our vehicles for a variety of reasons. Number one is which there's a passenger side brake on our vehicles, and we have a wide variety of adaptive equipment so we can adjust if we're not successful with one. So then once somebody has gotten through that training process, then we would be helping Jessica to identify the most appropriate vehicle. It could be the vehicle that she already owns, but like we talked about earlier, if somebody now has to transport a power wheelchair, they may need to have some sort of a new vehicle as well. So we would connect somebody with a mobility equipment dealer, talk about the vehicle that we're modifying, and then the evaluator writes what's called a vehicle modification prescription, or something close to that title, and that will outline the Jessica's situation, the vehicle that we're modifying, any mobility device that we need to transport, and the adaptive equipment that needs to be installed. Then we will meet that, Jessica in this case, at the mobility dealer at the time of installation, so that we can do a checkout drive and know that everything is working beautifully in her personal vehicle following that installation.
So when someone is ready for that vehicle, do you provide the vendor or the accessible vehicle dealer for them, or is that something they have to find on their own?
No, we're happy to provide a list of qualified vendors, in her area or in our area, because it's important for that person to develop a relationship with that dealer, that mobility equipment dealer, so that any repairs or warranty work or maintenance can be done, at a qualified dealer that's close to home.
Simon tells us that he receives disability benefits for his MS. He knows the cost of modified vehicles is high. His question is pretty simple. How can he pay for what he needs?
Yeah. I'll tell you, the MS Society has been really supportive of driver rehab. But there's other programs that are available. So we get, a lot of referrals from the vocational rehab program. Every state has a vocational rehab program, and depending on if he is still out in the workforce, that would be a common program for somebody to go to so that he can maintain his employment, which is really what the vocational rehab's goal is to make sure that individuals with whatever disability they may have are able to continue to be employed. The VA system is also, helpful in that. And then we'll find other funding sources out and about as well. Churches or synagogues will often help to fund some of these things as sort of part of their health mission. We have different foundations in our community that we've connected with. So, our practice publishes a list of funding resources that we can provide to folks to help them with the expense.
We heard from Lucy. Her situation is a little different from Simon's. Lucy is still able to work, but she's also worried about the cost of vehicle modifications. Now, Lucy tells us that she actually drives a van, and she's wondering if she can have her van modified for less than it would cost to purchase an already modified van.
So that completely depends on the age of Lucy's van and the number of miles that are on it, and really, to be honest, the make and model of the van as well. So there are very specific requirements that the lowered floor vehicle modifiers have for those vehicles. So that would be a direct question that would have to go to the mobility equipment dealer.
Well, you shared some very useful and really important information about how to drive safely when you're living with MS. What would you say are the top three takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
I think that it's really important that that people know that a diagnosis of MS certainly does not prohibit them from being able to drive, but it may be in a different fashion. And so we just need to make sure that somebody is still safe out there and driving. The second thing would be to be properly licensed following a diagnosis of MS, and then that really there are funding options for folks. We just have to be a little creative sometimes.
Well, thanks for sharing your expertise with us. I think we have time to answer a few more questions from our audience. We heard from Katie. Now, Katie's looking into getting a modified vehicle, but says she doesn't really like the look of a van. Does Katie have other car model options?
Yeah, actually, Braun Ability modifies a Chevy Traverse, which is a SUV. So that is certainly an option for her without getting into the minivan realm. But there's also other, sort of modifications that can be added to an existing vehicle. So again, depending on the vehicle itself, there's other companies that have, Adapt Solutions, for instance, has different equipment that will help somebody to get up and into a vehicle, different styles of seats, for instance, or an arm that comes out and brings a manual wheelchair into the midship of a non-lowered floor minivan, or other companies that have a sort of a crane style lift that will lift a scooter or wheelchair into the bed of a pickup. So there are, and there's others as well, but that's really part of the reason that it's important to connect with professionals that work in this area every single day, whether they're other driver evaluators like myself or mobility equipment dealers. These are the things that we do each and every day. And so we have annual conferences that keep us up on the latest adaptive equipment that are available for our community members.
Sheila tells us that she's lived with relapsing remitting MS for over 30 years,
Wow.
but she doesn't generally experience any physical symptoms. She's almost 65 years old, and Sheila is wondering if she should automatically have her driving evaluated once she hits a certain age.
I'm not really a proponent of age-related assessments or retesting. It has everything to do with one's skill. So I've often said that I have evaluated people over the years that are in their late 70s and 80s that are really great drivers. And then I've seen other folks at the age of 60 that are not. And so it really has everything to do with one's skill level and their responsibility as a driver out there, and the effects that their driving has on themselves and their passengers, certainly, but the other drivers as well. So, if somebody is beginning to be concerned about their driving, I think that it's a good idea to identify the baseline of their skill, and maybe the evaluator will have some recommendations that will make them feel more confident out and driving, even on those days that she's not feeling quite as good.
Lucas says he's feeling frustrated because his son suggested he have a driving evaluation. Lucas tells us he's been driving since he was a teenager, and he wants to know why he would need to be evaluated now.
Yeah, Lucas, it's really related to this diagnosis. I think that we've all been driving and we apparently have been doing it successfully, but it has everything to do with the fact that MS could affect somebody's ability to drive safely, whether it is someone's cognition or motor skills or sensory. We just need to make sure that somebody continues to be a safe driver. So, this is a common concern that many people have, is that they've their children are now bringing up this really very difficult topic. And so I think that it's important to know that our adult children don't want us to limit our ability to be independent. And so if somebody is bringing it up, it generally is a genuine concern, and just wanting to make sure that their parent is safe and covering all those bases as far as the legalities of it.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted some great questions, and thank you, Jenny, for being with us today.
You're so welcome.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends. You'll hear about ways to get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. I'd like to thank Jenny for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. On YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. And on Twitch, you can find that link in the chat. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Jenny Nordine and National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.